Hi guys, Jimmy McIntyre here with a quick tutorial showing you how to use Raya Pro 3 to create a really soft landscape. And we're going to look at some fairly basic techniques, but also a useful technique for shaping your masks. Now the image we're going to create is this one that you see on your screen right now. And the exposures we're working with is this dark exposure here and this brighter exposure here. And we're going to take the sky from this darker exposure and replace it with the sky in this exposure and some of the water too. Now before we go on, I just want to tell you that Raya Pro is on sale right now up until Sunday the 15th of April and until 2 o'clock British time. So if you're interested in the panel, you can get 25% starting today and ending on Sunday. Now let's start with the tutorial. I'm going to select both exposures and I'm going to clean them with lens corrections, remove chromatic aberration and enable profile corrections. So those are just the usual changes that I make in Adobe Camera Raw. Now, sometimes I choose to adjust some of my exposures so that they're ideal for exposure blending. So for this one, I'm probably just going to leave this the way it is right now and probably bring down the highlights a tiny bit because they looked a little bit bright there, so not too much, maybe -20. And for the bright exposure, I'm just going to leave that as it is, I think. Or maybe I can bring the exposure down a little bit. We want to use this exposure for the foreground and the mountains here. So we don't want them to be too bright. If it was like that, it just wouldn't be a very good base exposure. So we can manage the foreground just by bringing the exposure down. I think it was a little bit too bright initially. Now I'm going to select both of these layers, hold down Shift, and you see it says down here, Open Objects. And that will open our images as smart objects. Now we have our images open in two separate windows. I can simply press Stack. And this puts them together in one window as layers. So we have a darker exposure on top and our base exposure on the bottom. And I want to make a good selection of the sky here without selecting the mountains in the foreground. Now if I go into Instamask and choose Brights 1, let's say, you can see that we've still got some of the clouds in the selection. So even if I try and clean up the selection a little bit by making it really contrasting, we still have some clouds along here. Now I don't want the blend to be this contrasting anyway. We want the mountain to be a dark grey, but not necessarily black, because that creates a really contrasting blend. We need a smooth transition between our darker and brighter exposures. If we go for a crazy mask like this, it just won't fit together nicely. It'll look a little bit crazy. So if we bring the sliders down, and I'm looking here in particular at these mountains here, and I'm just making them dark enough so that they're not too affected by the mask. Now, for those of you who've watched either my art of photography course or my exposure blend like an expert course, you'll know already how to do this without dodging and burning. Because when we look at this mask, we still see that the clouds here are grey in the mask. And on this image, that's not really that important. We do want it to be lighter or white, but I think if we had blended the exposures with this particular mask, it'll be fine. But sometimes you might be working on an image where you have clouds all over the sky, which are patchy and grey, and you want to make them white. Now, through pre-masking, which is something I teach through my premium tutorials, you can do that really easily. But if you don't know how to do that, I'm going to show you a different way. And the first way is to open up a Dodge and Burn panel and choose Dodge, or you can press the Dodge tool to the left here. Now, for my settings for Dodge, I've got the range set to highlights and exposure at 50%. And this means it's going to affect only the brighter tones. Now, if I paint on here, it probably is just going to affect the sky, but you see it affected a little bit of the mountain there? And we don't want that. We just want it to affect the sky. So to make sure that we have a tighter selection so it doesn't affect the mountains, we can go to the mask and press Control on a PC or Command on a Mac, and now we've created our selection. See the marching ants around here? We can hide our ants by pressing Command and H or Control and H. Now watch what happens when I paint in here. You see we're not affecting the mountain. And I can do the same up here and along here too. And then when I'm finished, I press Control and D or Command and D, and that deselects the active selection. And when it comes to shaping our mask, we don't have to limit ourselves just to the highlights. If we wanted, we could choose the Burn tool. We could make sure shadows are selected, select our exposure, and look at that, we can darken our mountains if we want to make a more contrasting selection. Now I don't really want to do that in this particular image, and I've shaped the mask exactly how I'd like it to be. So I select my darker exposure, choose Instamask, and just press apply, and this applies our mask to the darker exposure. And we can make this darker layer visible by clicking this button here, or we can choose show layer. And now we've blended those exposures very nicely. The problem, however, is that the blend doesn't look very good. You see, we've lost contrast down here in the foreground, in the water a little bit, and in other areas. And now, again, those who've watched my art of photography course or my exposure blend like an expert course know exactly how to fix this through matching. Otherwise, if you don't know how to do that, we can open precision masks and we can go to fix dark blends. So we have the dark blend selected and we choose fix. When Photoshop's finished running, we can cycle through these buttons and choose the best outcome. Now, I think 5 or 4. Yeah, I'm going to go with 4. So that has restored the contrast in this tree here and given our image a little contrast boost. So if I press select, here's before we made those adjustments, so you can see the foreground's really flat, and this is after we made those adjustments. So it's a huge improvement. Now I want to keep this workflow relatively light. We don't have to do that much to it because Milford Sound in New Zealand is naturally a really beautiful place that doesn't take too much touching up. But one thing I do want to do is I'd like to give this sky more contrast, make it a little bit deeper, maybe give it a little bit more color. And we can do that through the glow-free layer in our dodge and burn panel. Now, before we do that, I want to press Command or Control on a PC and left click on this mask that we created earlier, because we only want to make changes that affect the sky. We don't want to affect the foreground. And we've already got a great mask for that. So now we've got our marching ants, we can open up our dodge and burn panel and we can go to glow free. Now I can hide my marching ants, and in the dodge and burn panel again, I'm going to choose a black brush, make sure it's a big brush, and I'm going to choose an opacity of 100% for this brush. And I'm going to paint in the sky, and you see we're deepening the color and the contrast in the sky beautifully. Now I might at a lower opacity also do the water here just a little bit. And now if we bring up the opacity of this glow-free layer, you see we can strengthen that effect. Now we don't want it to be too dark because that'll be just a little bit over the top. And if we're happy, we press Control and D or Command and D because we've still got an active selection there. So that's before and after. You see, we've given ourselves some beautiful contrast and depth there. Now, before I move any further, I actually want to crop this image. I was supposed to do that earlier, but I completely forgot about it. So I want to create more of a panoramic feel to this rather than having a big open space at the top. I want to make it long and thin and have more focus on this tree. So if we just reduce how much of the sky we actually see, we'll be forcing the viewer closer to the tree trunk. So I'm going to go for about here and press OK. And I think that looks great. It has a really intimate feel now that we're much closer to this tree. Now, why don't we give the image a bit of contrast? And to do that, I want to show you one technique that lots of photographers use when adjusting contrast in their image. There's a school of thought which says that sometimes when we have color in our image, it's difficult to make really accurate decisions about the contrast in our scene because the colors can be a little bit distracting. So to make some good contrast adjustments, often photographers will create a black and white layer like this and then choose a levels layer. And through that, they will make adjustments through the levels layer that look appropriate, and the colors don't distract from those adjustments. Now you can see we actually already have quite a few dark tones here, so I don't want to make it too dark, but I am going to mask out some of those areas if they're a little bit underexposed. And I'm going to bring the highlights slider along a little bit more, and the sky here is becoming overexposed, but that's okay because I can mask that out too. Now if I think that looks like there's enough contrast, I can make the black and white layer invisible. And so I'm going to delete this layer, and that's the before and after. So I think that's done a really good job. As I mentioned, the sky is probably a little bit overexposed, so I'm going to choose a black brush and just mask it out, only in the brightest parts of the sky there. So there we go, there's the before and after. And since we've done that, I think I can actually add a little bit more brightness. And finally, there we go. Now you may have noticed that I've got a little bit of sensor dirt in here. That's fairly easy to get rid of just with a clone stamp. So I've created a new layer and I'm choosing the clone tool here, and I have sample all layers selected. And if I zoom into the sky, I can then hold down Option on a Mac or Alt on a PC, select one part of the sky, and just clone that out there. And there we go. And now if I zoom out, I can do a before and after comparison, and that's much better. So now to finish, like I said, I want to keep this as a very simple workflow. I'm going to create a vignette, and I'm going to use the same vignette technique I've used lots of times before. So if you've seen a lot of my videos, you will have seen this before. I create a curves layer, bring down the upper midtones quite significantly, and maybe bring up the shadows a tiny bit. I don't want them to become too clipped. So I'm just dragging them upwards. Then I choose a white brush. I press Command and I or Control and I, and that inverts the mask on the curves layer and makes those changes invisible. And all I do is paint in that curves layer. So I'm going to make an opacity of 100% here. Now I'm actually going to undo that and choose a bigger brush. So we have a smoother transition between the areas that aren't included in the vignette. I'm going to go down here. I'm going to try and avoid the tree, but I am going to do some of the water because we need to darken that. And that looks much better. We've darkened the image. And now I want to create another curves layer. And this time I bring up the highlights, but add a little bit of contrast. So it's a small S curve. The point being, however, to brighten the image. Now again, I press Command and I or Control and I to invert that mask. And all I do is paint in the areas where I want the viewer to look. So I want the viewer to look here roughly, where the mountains are, where the sunset is, and maybe a little bit down here on the tree. So we're just brightening up the tree a little bit. Now if I press Command and G and Control and G with these two layers selected, we group them, and that's the before and after. You see, we've given it a little bit more depth. We're pushing the viewer towards the center part of the image. Now, I can strengthen that effect just in case you can't see a massive change. So I've darkened the outside of the vignette. And here I'm brightening up the center of the vignette. So there we go, before and after. There's a huge change there. And we've taken away some of the details in the corner here because we don't really need them. It's a little bit distracting. So we had an open image like this, and now we've got a nicely closed image which is concentrated on the horizon and the tree trunk in the foreground. Now, when I sharpen and prepare my images for Facebook or for online or 500 pics, I usually go to Filters and Finish and choose by width 2048, press OK. Now, I don't know if that is still the optimal size for the internet, but it was recommended to me years ago for getting the best quality images on Facebook, and I've always done it, and it's never really caused any problem. I don't seem to have particularly soft images when I publish on Facebook. And most of the time, I don't add any extra sharpening. I go with the not sharpened image. Now that's still actually slightly sharpened because of the resizing process, but because I use a tripod and take my time trying to find the ideal point for focusing on an image, which can be different depending on whichever scene you're working on, I generally find that my raw files are sharp enough. I don't need to add too much sharpening. And that's it. That's your tutorial for how we can go from an image with overexposed highlights to one where we recover the sky, we deepen the color in the sky, we add some accurate contrast adjustments, and we clean it and add a great vignette, and ultimately come out with a much moodier image. So I hope you found that useful. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.